Welcome, everyone. I would first of all like to acknowledge the Turrbal and Yugara as the First Nation owners of the land where I currently now reside at West End. I pay respects to their elders, laws, customs and creation spirits. I recognise that these lands have always been places of teaching, research and learning, and I'd particularly like to honour that ancestry. Welcome to the first Southeast Queensland Australian Science Communicator event of the year. We hope it's the first of many. This is one in a series of Tuesday TellTales that we record and we put on the Southeast Queensland ASC Facebook site. So make sure to check out some of the past ones, and this one will also be available afterwards if you want to catch it again for a second time. I would like to thank Melina and Michelle in the background who've been organising and coordinating these events and who are producing this for us today. There will be time for potentially for your questions as well. So if you have questions, put them in the chat, and then we will, if there's time towards the end, then we'll get to those questions and we'll answer them. Franzisca may also decide to answer them as we're going as well, particularly if I tend to talk too much, which I try not to when I'm interviewing somebody. For those that don't know me, I'm Jenni Metcalfe, and I'm a member of the I'm a member of the Australian Science Communications. And in fact, I'm a foundation member and a lifetime member. If you would like to find out more, then I suggest you go to the ASK website and find out more about this amazing group of people that are operating within Australia. I would like to introduce formally to our Tuesday TellTales, Dr. Franzisca Weder. Now, she told me that I could call her Fran, but she was a little hesitant about the Australianism of this, of calling her Franny, which is what we tend to do in Australia, is that we shorten words and we put IE on the end. And it's affectionate Fran, but I'll try to keep it to Fran because I'm not sure I'm pronouncing Franzisca properly. Now, Fran has a lot of international expertise, Germany, US, New Zealand, and now Australia. She's working at the University of Queensland as senior lecturer, and she's focusing on sustainability communication and corporate social responsibility, which we'll find out more about what those things mean soon. But welcome, Fran, to Tuesday TellTales.
Thanks for having me.
Now, let me tell you that I knew about Fran before I first met her because she gave a terrific visual talk at the Public Communication of Science and Technology Network about trashination, which maybe we'll touch on a bit later. But that's actually available online, so have a search of it on the PCST, Public Communication of Science and Technology Network, and you'll see Fran talking about fractionation in 3 minutes. And I think there's videos there too, isn't there, Fran? But let me tell you about how I first physically met Fran. It was a very wet, rainy Brisbane day, like we've had a lot of lately, in fact, too much of lately. And Fran arrived on her bike, and it was one of those stand-up bikes that you sort of like you can sit upright on, and it's got a front basket and panniers, and she had a skirt on. And I thought she must have just ridden from around the corner, but in fact she rode about 10 kilometres away from Kenmore Hills, and I couldn't quite believe it. So my first question, Fran, is biking part of your whole communication about sustainability?
It partly is, or I should probably better say it kind of became part of my new Australian identity as a very sustainable person. I don't know, biking was always kind of normal for me, living in Germany, living in Austria, either in kind of urban areas in Vienna or more kind of in villages or on the countryside. Everyone kind of bikes, and I had always a trailer in the back with some kids in there, and this was kind of normal. And then I came to Australia, and then I realized that kind of if you really are crazy enough to go on a bike, then you definitely should wear kind of full-on lycra and go on a proper bike and label it as sport. and not as kind of, oh, I'm going to uni, or I meet some wonderful friends. So I get a lot of beeps, and I get a lot of kind of, I apparently irritate people, which is great. And here we are at my kind of identity as probably, sustainability warrior, whatever you can call me. Even if I'm labeled as hippie from like neighbors who still can't understand what I'm doing. I started to really like to irritate people and to at least make them think.
So do you think that that's an important part of science communication, irritating people and making them think, getting them outside of their comfort zone?
Yes, absolutely. So this is probably the core of my thinking, that this idea or concept of problematization plays such an important role in science communication and communication about climate change and in sustainability communication. I think we can talk more about sustainability being this wicked term and really abused quite a bit. But like when we think about science communication as kind of the inter and transdisciplinary area that we're talking about today, the idea of waking people up to create those moments of disruption where people start to reflect. They are super important, and the most important thing that happens in those disruptions is that people suddenly, they are looking for their core values again, because this is what you need. If you're disrupted, you need to go back to your values and say, oh, okay, this is what I really want, and this is why I think this is good behavior, bad behavior, this is why I think this is great, or I don't believe that. So it always kind of brings you back to your kind of normative framework that you work with and all those guiding principles. And this happens in those disruptive or the situations where you're irritated. And when we talk about science communication as something that is more kind of professionally done and where it's more strategically done, then problematization is something that can be planned, that is part of strategic communication. And so I think it is at the core.
I might come back and explore that word problematization a bit later, Fran. But I wanted to learn a little bit about your journey into becoming a disruptive science communicator. Was there a moment in childhood? Did you grow up in Austria or Germany?
I'm from Germany, and I grew up in Germany. And we kind of started to travel the world a bit. So we, after being at uni, where I met my husband, we moved to Vienna and then further down to the south of Austria. And we always traveled quite a bit. So we had a VW van, and then chuck all the kids in there. And
I do think you are a hippie.
I know. I'm kind of thrown back to this identity there. Kind of like, oh my God, I am. Oh God.
She's a disruptive. She's a disruptive hippie science communicator.
And so we kind of try to explore those areas where not everyone else is going. So we kind of went to to all those former Yugoslavian countries and up to the Czech Republic, into kind of remote areas, not to be super alternative or hippie, but more kind of to kind of show the kids the world and tell them a bit about how different people can be and how awesome this is. And so I think this was traveling and kind of being very open-minded was always part of my private life, but then my professional life, and kind of having these fellowships and teaching at different universities across the globe. But I think this moments of disruption sneaked in. I'm not quite sure if there's a key event, but it's probably because I think I am a tiny bit rebellious again.
A tiny bit? I think you're probably very rebellious, Fran.
Probably. It's kind of, I do like to do things a bit different. And this is kind of not on purpose necessarily, but then kind of I discover myself as kind of, I really want to kind of show that everything's possible. And when I talk to younger kind of early career researchers where, and then there are those kind of women who think, okay, I can't have kids and a career in academia. And it's well, no, it just depends on what you do. And it depends on kind of, I don't know. I think it's about just being very courageous and get to the point where you really question things. And I think this moment of, okay, not taking everything for granted and not taking everything for, okay, this is normal and I have to play out the rules of the system. I mean, I think this is a very crucial point for everything we do.
Now, Fran, you've mentioned a few times kids, but I believe you actually have 4 sons.
That is true.
You don't even have the easy girls. You've got 4 sons, and you've got a full-time job at the University of Queensland, plus a number of other teaching jobs. You're supervising a number of PhD students. You're also working as a consultant. You're also the chair of the International Communication Association. How do you do all that?
I don't know, with a big smile on my face. And I think it's one part is that things kind of tend to happen to me. And then I find myself in a new situation. I feel like, oh, okay, that's actually quite nice. So give it a go. And I think it's a long kind of learning process of really just jumping into the cold water and then just have a swim and enjoy that. It's actually refreshing and that it's actually quite, I don't know, stimulating or however you want to frame it. Yes, there is a lot of testosterone in my house, and sometimes I'm slowly entering this new kind of period in my life where I'm really interested in finding my kind of female, I don't know, women caves, or I don't know how to realize that. I didn't get very far there so far, but
yeah, okay. Well, I wanted to come back to what you talked about, problematization. Is that linked to what you talk about as communicative responsibility? And can you explain that, particularly in the science communication context?
Yeah, so I think problematization per se is part, or should be part of, every communication process. So whenever we communicate, we make an issue out of something, which is basically problematization. Can
you give me an example?
So I will link it to another eco-culture jam that I did. So the one that you mentioned.
First, you better explain what an eco-jam is.
Okay. So I started to kind of create a bit of a different learning setting when I was teaching in Austria. Main reason was that the students were predominantly out of the region, so they didn't really had this wider horizon, so they didn't have the wider understanding of the world. So I tried to really kind of flip the classroom over and take them for a walk. And so we went outside and looked at a few things. And the idea of culture jamming is a very critical idea. It's located in advertisement, and everyone, like probably some of you already knows some of the work of Kurt Larson and those people who kind of reframe those corporate icons like Nike or Coca-Cola, McDonald's, and they kind of twist it around in a way that it actually makes an issue out of all the bad things they actually do in terms of environmental destruction or social disadvantages and stuff. And the idea of eco-culture jamming, this is something where I worked with Tema Milstein, a wonderful colleague and friend who kind of started to work with these critical pedagogies and started to do this eco-culture jamming, which basically means that you start with something that everyone thinks that's pretty normal or like a certain behavior pattern, and then you crack this pattern. And one thing that we did is we work with plastic waste, and this is the eco-culture jam called Final Trashtination. And
that was the problem, that was plastic trash the problem?
Yeah, it was about plastic trash, and what we tried to crack was this principle when we deal with waste is that we kind of, as soon as we throw it in the bin, we get rid of it. We don't have to care about it. No one knows what's happening then. We are pretty relieved as soon as we put it in the right bin. Done, dusted, we've done our job. Like, we're pretty great at recycling. But then to crack this, like, it's not out of sight just because you put it in the bin. So that was the idea there. And the other thing where we problematized female period products, like female hygiene products, in a way where we tried to crack not only the kind of inequality in terms of financial investment and waste that you actually create, and you can't really get around it. But then we crack this pattern of no one really wants to talk about it, and we don't really want to see it. So what we did is we bought 350 packages of tampons and pads, which are like, this is the lifetime amount of every average woman that you need, 350 packages. And we bought that and we started to stack it up. So we tried to do a world record in stacking those products up in the middle of the town where the university was located. So the students and I were kind of started to stack, and we invited people to join us, to help us stacking and to start conversations. And this is where all this kind of culture jamming and all this activism is related to communication, because the main idea, which is then linked back to problematization, is to actually involve people in conversations and make them think and make them reflect and make them to bring in their own experiences and tell their own stories. And so they create this connection to the topic. And yes, you mentioned responsibility. I do feel an ethical duty to do that, to kind of disrupt those patterns, and by the same time to stimulate conversations. And as a teacher, I can offer communication, like I can create communication spaces, I can create room for those conversations within my lectures, but then by going out there and inviting people to join the conversations. By the way, with this period product, not many people were actually keen on helping us and talking about it, but hey, that was part of the message. So it's called My Bloody Waste, and you can find the video on YouTube too.
I guess living with 5 men would have helped you understand some of the cultural cringes around that. Now, you've been in Australia now for what, a couple of years?
2.5, yeah.
Oh, perfect. To sort of coincide with COVID.
I know, it did. We came bushfires, COVID. Now the flight's like awesome.
I know, it's been a good 2 years, hasn't it? Talk about being disrupted. We've certainly been disrupted out of our comfort zone. But what do you think, looking at Australia and Australia science communication, what do you think are the challenges that we face as communicators in Australia with some of these big issues?
Yeah. Well, I think there is a challenge, but I have to be very careful coming from Europe. I think there are certain issues that are more hidden than they are in Europe. When I think about climate change and the whole kind of awareness of everything that is happening, and especially when we talk about sustainability and solution and kind of sustainable development. Like people do say it's 10 years behind, but this is kind of, well, true, not true, depends on where you are. And it's different. I think this would be too kind of rigid to frame it that way. I think it is very, very important to create this understanding of how much risks and threats and those natural disasters and then possible solutions are really kind of something that is rooted within the culture. And I think there are a lot of things that are happening, a lot of crisis responses that are already there, but they are not labeled as sustainable solutions, and they are not really labeled as climate change response. So I think one job in Australia for science communicators is really to kind of get this deeper understanding and explore everything that is done that is just not labeled as, oh, we're doing this because, climate change is happening and we have to create resilience and we have to do this and that. We have to mitigate. So it's just not labeled, but the practices are probably there. And I think that could be one specific thing to do.
Certainly locally, and also in northern New South Wales, the floods have been a big disruptive force, that we're having them more and more. The second flood within 11 years. Are we just at the moment doing band-aid solutions to those issues instead of using that disruption to really be much more prepared for these things that are going to happen more and more often?
Yes, absolutely. And a tiny little plug, we just did this pretty impressive survey with people in Australia and in Austria in Europe, and we compared how
Austria and Australia.
Yeah.
They often get those names mixed up when you travel.
There are no kangaroos in Austria. But it's and it was really interesting because we did the survey after the first big wave of COVID, and we asked people for like how much they think they've been more sustainable due to all the regulations and the restrictions. And yes, people thought like, oh, actually, yes, I didn't travel, I didn't fly, like, oh, and I grew my own veggies, look at that. And we spent more time as a family. So in different dimensions, retail, mobility, and whatever, people were more sustainable, and they reflected on that as being something like, oh, actually, we can do that. But the sad news is that people, like this whole kind of social learning process didn't really happen. And people, especially in Australia, really want to go back to normal. This is probably related a tiny bit to a bit of a difference in terms of how much individual responsibility people want to take on, and how much responsibility is actually allocated to kind of the government and those big corporates and, you know, the industry, which is kind of very broad. And I think in Europe, it's the only comparison I have at the moment. There is a lot more kind of individual responsibility that people are willing to take, and they know that they can actually make change.
So how do we, as science communicators, motivate individuals to take that change? You talked about conversations, you talked about disruptive conversations, you talked about spaces for those conversations to take place. That takes a certain amount of energy, time, money, resources. How do we make those things a priority?
I think I'm sitting in a room with a lot of experts in terms of storytelling. I think this is definitely something that is very like, this is the way to go, to really create those examples and tell the stories, not only of things that are happening to people, but then all those tiny, very positive experiences of kind of where we as individuals are actually part of this socio-ecological transformation process that is happening. The second thing for science communicators, I had a very interesting conversation with a colleague of mine. He's a professor for communication in Germany. And I wrote some stuff, and I talked about campaigners, journalists, PR people, NGO communicators, and science communicators. And it was really interesting because he said, like, what is the species of science communicators that you're talking from? Because when we talk, like, the direct translation of science communicator, these people are PR people in Germany. These are just the PR people. They don't do like journalistic work. They don't do the publishing part. They don't do the storytelling part. It's more those kind of communicators, similar to a press officer or like a communication person, like they are in an organization like a university or like a science institution, and they try to translate and kind of transmit this or disseminate the information from the organization. So this is a pretty kind of old understanding of science communication, a very one direction kind of transmission focused understanding. And this is what I think is where Australia is actually far ahead in terms of science communication being not necessarily related to an organization, not necessarily related to that. So I think to create a better awareness of science communicator as a role, to do more kind of research and to work on a better understanding of science communities as the missing network hub or the missing network bit at least, or not, between journalists and then probably bloggers and influencers and campaigners, and then organizational communicators or strategic communicators in organizations and institutions. So I think to kind of work on that and create this understanding of this communicator role as something rather independent.
That sort of comes back to the notion of science communicators as boundary spanners. As people who sort of get people together, who help create those spaces and that time for conversations. And it brings in that whole notion of participatory science communication.
Yes.
Is that something that you've explored at all?
So I'm kind of getting there, and I started with like interview series with communicators of all kind, and we started with kind of pretty classic with journalists and PR people in 2011 when I was in New Zealand. And then kind of I did a few more of these interview series in Europe, and then we did another one now kind of comparing Germany, Austria, Australia, New Zealand again. And this time we tried to kind of be a bit more, to be broader and to start with our theoretical idea of, okay, we talked to 5 journalists and 5 PR people. And then it got actually quite messy because people are kind of, they are not linked to one profession anymore. And I think it is challenging because it raises the question of, is it like a communicator that talks about kind of science and then someone else talks about music and culture and someone else talks about sport or communicates about sport? Or is science communicator, is there something that is role inherent that we really need to find out what it is? So this is where I'm at the moment. It's actually not easy to identify differentiate web publishers and bloggers and influencers from journalists and PR people, because we all know that journalists, like people who study journalism, they will end up in PR anyway, because this is where the money is. So it's very fluent. But as a researcher, I'm like, oh, I really need to, I want to know more how we can create those boundaries and then identify those roles who are more kind of a network hub or boundary spanner.
I think I'd like to explore with you sometime the notion of what is a science communicator.
Mm-hmm.
But you mentioned individual responsibility, but you're also interested in corporate social responsibility, which is now often legislated in various countries and so on. But we are seeing, I think, in Australia, more leadership from the corporate sector when it comes to sustainability than we are from governments, for example. So what's your take on the corporate social responsibility side of things?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, that's right. I forgot you're a hippie activist, disruptionist.
On the barricade. No, it's a very, very important question, and I know this is the beauty of things, because there is actually a movement in corporates across the world to do much better and to really kind of go back to, like, what are the core values? Like, how can we create this kind of connection between ethics and economics? How can we create those alternatives, at least within our capitalistic or neoliberal system? So I think there is still a bit of a lack over there in creating alternatives to the existing system. But when we look at what is happening, then it definitely, yes, the corporates have taken this on, and there is a beautiful development. There is a lot of activities and behavior change, and a lot of change happening in terms of this kind of broader understanding, and the understanding of corporates and organizations as being really embedded in the society, like being very aware of all these different relationships and all these different interactions they really have to be careful about and responsible for.
It brings me to a good question that's been put in the chat, and a reminder, you can put questions in chat. Saren Starbridge says he or she, I'm wondering about the relationship between sustainability and power. Can people be powerful and sustainable? How about if the power is political or financial? So you've got the financial power, political power. Can those two sides of things also be sustainable?
That is a very, very awesome question, because that is the old problem of the whole corporate social responsibility discussion, because it's always about this binary between ethics and economics and how they kind of get closer together and how we can create this holistic understanding. But sustainability is very different. So we're not talking about power. We're not talking about responsibility. Sustainability is very simple. a normative principle, it's a value. It has the potential, but this is my very personal point of view, it has the potential to develop into something like a universal value, like democracy. So it is a core principle that can guide individual action, it can guide organizational or corporate and even political action and activities. But it's not related to power, because you can't create or you can't become powerful just because you kind of let your action be directed by sustainability or be guided by sustainability. It's a moral principle, a normative principle, a guiding principle, a value. And therefore, I think the power discussion has to be, it's related to other things.
Now, I'm going to ask you in a minute what some of your highlights are where you think you've made a real difference. But as a lead into that question, Michelle makes the comment that you look really positive and energetic. So how do you stay like that in the face of so many intractable environmental problems?
That is a good question. I think it's one thing is that definitely if you look in the eyes of your kids, you know, okay, this is kind of like they have so much energy and they believe in this world and they will find their way. So this is definitely encouraging. And I think there are so many kind of beautiful things that are happening every day. And I'm very, very intrigued and very passionate about all this kind of conversations. And this is probably because you asked me, like, how do you do that? It's because I'm really interested in these networks or in networking and kind of thinking, talking and communicating with other people. So this gives me a lot of energy, and this is where kind of my thinking is stimulated, and this is where change is then actually happening, because then I just get an idea out of this conversation and they can multiply it in the next conversation and the next setting. So this is how I kind of create these connections between everything I do. So it's not like a next to each other, it's more kind of a whole kind of big communication thing.
On the wall behind your computer, do you have this giant spreadsheet where it's got kids this, ICA this, university this, consultancy this?
I don't know. It's more like I feel very limited recently, just because I feel this kind of lack of connection after not being able to see family, friends, colleagues, like which I met on conferences, and I had definitely a year with struggling quite a bit, and so it's just this kind of to recreate those connections in a digital environment is much harder. And I really want to hug people. Hippy. No, but really, seriously. Since you said that, I'm kind of constantly kind of reflecting on my action. I was like, oh my God, I actually am.
Everyone, we have about 10 minutes, so if you've got questions, please put them in the chat because we'd like to ask them. But I'm coming back to that question I had before, Fran, and that is there like one or two or maybe three real highlights so far in your career where you feel like something that you did or were part of, maybe you didn't initiate it, really made a significant change?
Well, I think I like this kind of doing things differently in a university setting. These moments where I did this eco-culture jamming, where I kind of took the students and let them out of the classroom. And even at UQ, if I like the moment 2 years ago during Sustainability Week, where I sat down at the main court with blackboards and chalk and make people write down their associations when they think about sustainability, and everyone was like, what are you doing here? But everyone really loved it. So I think the more established and sandstone like traditional a place gets, the more I think the bigger the difference actually is that you can create or that you can make. I think with those tiny little moments, so I think there is an impact, at least on a student that I have on students, with the way I teach, the way I talk, and the things I do. And probably And maybe even those things like going to conferences with a baby, like every year and every second year having some kind of like tiny little one there, and things just kind of happen. Like I get like having my 7-month-old here, and then chatting to people from New Zealand, and then someone else join, and like, oh, we're actually looking for someone who kind of we need someone for a year taking over a teaching fellowship, and then like, oh, would you like to come? And I'm like, oh, why not? I have a chat with my husband. And then, of course, the big difference then makes to have a partner on board who carries the boys through their everyday life, and who's there. And the very kind of the big value with my husband is that he's the practitioner. So whenever I get too theoretically, he's like, oh, just come back to the real world. So he gives me the proof.
I think all researchers need a practitioner to give them a reality check.
It does. I just switch on the light.
Okay, no problems. While we're waiting for Fran to come back, don't forget you can ask questions. We've got a few more minutes left. Fran, I noticed in your publications that 2020 and 21 and continuing on, COVID has become a new theme. What have you been looking at with COVID, and how might that you have some things that are useful or interesting to science communicators?
Yeah, definitely. Well, I tried not to get too deep into that because I did some health communication at the beginning of my academic career, and some kind of health campaigns and health communication in the area of schizophrenia and how this is communicated or not communicated. I think this is probably something that is very typical for me, to find those topics that no one talks about. And COVID, like there is a lot of research happening around COVID at the moment, but what I'm really interested in is like how much COVID made people think more about their values, and how much they kind of, with this disruption, like what happened to people facing this disruption. And what did people really start to think about, and how? So this is probably the main interest here with COVID.
I noticed that one interest was looking at what happens post-COVID in terms of sustainability
and future vision.
Yeah, and future vision. So are we post-COVID yet? If not, when will we be post-COVID? And what is our sustainability vision?
I know. I think I think we are not quite post-COVID, but I think we will not be post-COVID at any point in the future. So I think to create these visions of the future is more an exercise. And I think this is another kind of area where science communicators can really kind of further kind of walk on this pathway to stimulate people to think about their visions for the future, to actually kind of visualize things, to work with visual stimuli, to work with gamification approaches, to work with kind of postcards to the future or whatever, to create those conversations and stimulate conversations where people are actually forced to create an idea of the future, to avoid this, or we want to kind of be in this post-COVID to then go back to normal, to what was pre-COVID. But there won't be a pre-COVID because that's it now. And we, like, despite COVID, despite of war and despite of natural hazards, we need to create those visions of the future, and we have to make them shared visions. So this is the key where then the professional communicators come into play, because those like individual visions are great, but we need to create those shared visions, and we have to create this kind of culture of sustainability. And we can just cultivate this by just kind of creating more visions and create those platforms where those shared visions can merge. That was pretty philosophical at the end, hey?
It does. So I'm going to put on your husband's hat and say, practically, what does that mean for science communicators? I mean, how do we help there be that vision in our governments, in our society, even within ourselves?
Yeah, I think it is really about this bringing in the dimension of space And especially in times where everything, like when we experience distance, I think now as professional communicators, we can create the space where people can actually come together and talk again. And science communicators can make an issue out of something. They can kind of create these conversation spaces related to a certain issue. So they have the proficiency, they have the background, and they have the knowledge and the link or the link to what is actually happening. But they can create and facilitate those conversational spaces.
Okay, Michelle's put in there that she's wondering if, this is the last question, she's wondering about the role of digital spaces for creating that community sharing, particularly given pandemics, I suppose. And she also says TikTok. And I know that you've done something looking at TikTok versus Facebook.
Absolutely. I think it's this is where those conversations can actually happen. And yes, to TikTok, and even if I'm like, my 14-year-old tells me, like, I did try some TikTok for a lecture, and he was like, oh my gosh, like, don't do it, Mom, just don't do it. So apparently professional communicators are needed. But yes, of course, this is what social and digital media offer. They offer the space, they offer conversational spaces. But of course, it needs professional communicators to kind of facilitate those conversations and to kind of give it a certain kind of framework. And because, of course, the digital space and all that social media, the disadvantage is that everything, like, they make an issue out of everything. But I do believe that there is a lot of potential to use this space, to create the space for stories and where those shared visions can sit, where they can be further shared. But by the same time, I strongly believe, and this is kind of post-COVID, or kind of, as I said, after experience distance, I think this kind of really interaction and personal interaction gets a new meaning.
Excellent, excellent. I actually experienced TikTok at Christmas with my grandniece when she asked me to dance with her. Interestingly enough, my dance with her got more hits than any of her other dances, and I think it was because of my my uncoordinated approach. Anyway, anyway, I would like. We've got another comment. I better just double check that. Oh yes, some nice inspirations. Thank you, says Saren, and a few other people have thanked you as well. We're coming towards the end. I'm not sure whether Melina or Michelle can make it unspotlight us and put us all on so that we can see everyone, and everyone can switch their video and their sound on, and we can see everyone. Excellent. Because I would like to very much thank Dr. Franzisca Weder, or should I say Fran, or my preference, Franny, for a fabulous 45 minutes discussion. And remember that you can catch this on the Southeast Queensland Ask Facebook site. And you can now see on the screen as well, Michelle and Melina, who've helped to organise this. Check out the Facebook site, check out some past Tuesday TellTales, and we'll be back in the future with more interesting, fascinating people to have a chat with. Thank you, everybody, and goodbye.
Thank you, Jenni.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.